Welcome to Perceptions Today podcast, where we discuss consciousness in all forms. January 2023, episode 36, Questions with Anthony Peake in a Roundtable, part 1 of 4. He is a writer who deals with the borderline areas of human consciousness.
And it's not moving, which means that violates Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is, again, impossible. So therefore, there has to be a form of energy down there. Now, this energy itself seems to be in a field form. But not only that, I wrote a book a few years ago with Professor Irvin Laszlo. And Laszlo and I are really fascinated by the implications of this 0 point field. And we believe it's an energy field. We believe not only is it an energy field, it's an information field.
This is an instance of the conversation coming up in the roundtable discussion. Participants knew it was being recorded. Welcome to Perceptions Today. It's UK date the 15th of December 2021, and today we have our esteemed guest is Anthony Peake. If you've never been to the Perceptions Today account or interacted with us before, we're all about consciousness research in all areas along with pain management. I am your host, Paul, and also your co-host is for the Twitter space CentredAwareness, dealing in meditation and coaching and energy work, also known as Melissa. Say hello, Melissa.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. It's going to be a very exciting evening or day for people in other parts of the world. Remember, this is a live Q&A session with Anthony Peake, so feel more than comfortable to ask Anthony any question that you might have.
As long as it stays on topic and we can answer those questions, which is good. We also have some live events, so I'll do a quick public service announcements. In 2022, on January the 6th, we have Stephanie Quick talking about synchronicity on a live Twitter space. Then on the 13th of January, we have Elaine Meyer talking about Kundalini energy and her life on a live space as well. Then again, on the 1st of March, we have R.N. Vooght talking about his research and books. One of the books is Spirit in the Sky, where he'll be talking about mythology, DMT, brain structures, and other topics along there. If you want to listen to any of the trailers, go to the podcast Perceptions Today, and you will hear from those people. And also, there is a very good episode called From a Drop to an Ocean, where 9 other people who interact with our community, who are researchers and podcasters, are talking about themselves, so you get a taste of who they are. Anthony's books, I'm just watching the icons now fire up. Anthony's books deal with consciousness in all forms, along with backing up his research with scientific publications. He has now published 11 books, with his 12th one on the way in June 2022. He's had sales of over 110,000 in international languages. He has spoken around the world on being a guest on many a podcast. It's my great pleasure to welcome Anthony Peake. Please take the floor and introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm really delighted to be involved in this what could we call it, experiment almost, to see whether we can get out and discuss the ideas to as many people as possible. Thank you very much for spending time here. I know that the timing for some of you may be difficult, but it's one of the logistics here of doing an international discussion like this, that this will always be the case. So I'm really looking forward to some of the questions. The last show we did was really excellent, and there were some excellent questions and some excellent discussions. A word of warning, though, I have quite a strange sense of humour, and I tend to go off on tangents as well, because my interests are far wider than even the areas I write about. So if I feel that this is an interesting topic that is off topic, I'm quite happy to go off topic as well, once it doesn't get too strange. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this. It's going to be a fascinating couple of hours.
Excellent. And what we'll do is we will go with Mark, as he had his hand up first.
Thank you. I'm curious what your take is on near-death experiences, and whether that works in with your idea of mysterious altered states of consciousness. And second part of that is, how do you feel that relates to pineal gland and DMT?
What a fantastic starting question, Mark. That is absolutely superb, and literally the areas that I discuss extensively in my books. Let's start with the near-death experience first. I've written a direct book on the near-death experience, and indeed the introduction and the preface to my first book, Is There Life After Death, was written by none other than Professor Bruce Grayson, who's professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia. And Bruce at the time was the editor of the International Journal of Near-Death Studies. And in fact, it was Bruce that really started me on my career of writing, because Bruce asked me to write an academic paper for the Journal of Near-Death Studies, outlining in general terms my concept of cheating the ferryman. But let's go into a little bit about the near-death experience. Now, the near-death experience is something effectively that has been perceived by people since as long as records have began. The first real recording of a supposed near-death experience was in ancient Greece, when there was something called the legend of E.R. And he was a gentleman that died on a battlefield, or seemingly died on a battlefield. And when he came to, he described going into an altered state of consciousness. He described meeting other beings, a place of light that he went, and everything else as well. But it was only really in the 1960s that the near-death experience really came to the fore, when a guy called Raymond Moody wrote a book called Life After Life. Because Moody had been fascinated for many years by people who made reports that they were very close to death and they had some extraordinary experiences during this time. Now, Moody then isolated a number of traits that were standardized that people who had had these experiences would describe. And this was followed on by my friend Bruce Grayson, who also did a similar exercise. And near-death experiences are generally, they have similar processes internationally. So effectively, one can reasonably argue that this is a neurological set of conditions that take place just before we die. Now, of course, because it is a moot question as to whether anybody has actually died back. And of course, some people will argue that people are flatlined and they come back, so therefore they were technically dead. Well, I don't think that is necessarily true. I don't think anybody's actually physically died and come back, but they've been as damn near death as possibly could be. And they regularly report us a group of reactions or moody traits. And these include the idea of being in a disembodied state, in an out-of-body state, the feeling and sensation of going down a tunnel, the meeting of other entities called the beings of light, and all one singular entity known as the being of light. People also say that time dilates, time seems to slow down. And also, most importantly, for my overall hypothesis, my cheating the ferryman hypothesis, is something they experience called the panoramic life review. Now, the panoramic life review is quite fascinating. And in my next book, which is coming out in June of next year, I'll be expanding upon this. And I have a whole section on the panoramic life review. And in simple terms, the panoramic life review is, quote, my life flashed before my eyes. And you find this quite regularly in reports where people will turn around and say that I saw my whole life. I either witnessed my whole life or I was guided through my whole life by the being of light. And what tends to happen is the being of light will take you back through your life. Now, of course, this is incredibly reminiscent, is it not, because it's Christmas time. And of course, one of the most popular novels of Christmas, I think, was written around about 1857, something like that, by Charles Dickens, called A Christmas Carol. And if you recall, in A Christmas Carol, this is what happens. Scrooge has a series of dreams, which are like near-death experiences, where he sees his past and he witnesses his own past. And he witnesses not only his own past, but the implications of his actions on other people. Now, again, if anybody is interested in following up on this, one of my friends, a guy that contacted me because of my writings, is a guy called William Merthyr. And Bill Merthyr had the most extraordinary near-death experience where he fell in the sea. It's a fascinating story. And what happened was he was running along the seawall down in Dawlish on the south coast of England, in Devon, one March evening. And as he was cycling, and as he was cycling along, a wave came up over the seawall and knocked him off his bike. He then struggled to pick the bike up, and another wave came across and it threw him into the sea. He fell 40 feet straight into the sea, and then found himself in the water with the tide going out. Now, March in the UK, in the English Channel, is quite cold, and he started to suffer from hypothermia. He was a strong swimmer, but he realized he wasn't going to be able to get out of the water. And suddenly, a voice manifests in his head. As the hypothermia starts to take account, a voice manifests in his head. But before that, and this is another thing that people sense when they have near-death experiences, is the oneness of everything. He said that while he was in the water, he realized he was the seagulls flying above him. He realized he was the cliffs. He realized he was the waves around him. He suddenly had a loss of identity, a disassociation for a technical term. And then suddenly, and this is where it gets extraordinary, he said he suddenly found himself running across a street, and he was in his body as a 7-year-old child, and he's running across a street, and as he looks up, there's a car, and the car hits him, and it broke his leg, and he felt the pain of the car hitting him. Then suddenly, he wasn't in that body anymore. And this is extraordinary. He said he was looking down at a woman's leg, and she was scratching. She had a pair of nylons on, and she was scratching them because she had a ladder in her nylons. And she looks up to see a kid running across the road, and she hits the kid. He then felt all the pain that she felt when she hit him, because this was an actual incident in his own past. He felt her get out of the car. He was seeing it through her eyes. Now, this is intriguing because it means that not only do we, when we have a panoramic and past life review, we experience things that other people experience as well, and we can touch on this later. But effectively, what this seems to be taking place here is that the human mind seems to be able to record in some way or other all our past life experiences. And I argue in my first book that there's a reason for this, because I argue that at the point of death, everybody has a panoramic life review. We all have a panoramic life review. Now, just very quickly going back on the panoramic life
Can
review.
I just pause you there? Because obviously I think if you asked people to do the 100% symbol for the circumstances that you've been discussing, I think you'll probably find a lot of people in this room have actually experienced either time dilation, the kind of multiple futures that could have happened within accidents, and also those, because obviously near-death experiences don't need to be full minutes, they could be microseconds. As we had a discussion with our Twitter space environment, we went through the 17 different traits which you were going through. And a lot of the people, like Tamara and a few others in here, and Fuji, I think have also had that kind of thing. And it'd be nice to see a reflection of what goes on there. And then you can get back onto Mark's one. Yeah, so you see Tamara's had the same thing. So if anyone's had that kind of experience, just do the 100% symbol. Just kind of give us an idea. Sometimes we wait for icons because the time's late. Mark has, etc. Okay, that's great to see that response, and it will make sense now. You can again, I apologize for interrupting, but I will be interrupting at different points.
No, it's important. I'll ramble for England, so please do interrupt. And if there are areas that you think, no, we need to focus in on those, please make a note and we'll come back to them. But going quickly back to the whole time dilation thing as well. I mean, this is a known phenomenon. You know, when people are involved in accidents or car crashes, or even when they're given bad news, time seems to dilate. And again, this is a central concept in all my books. And in fact, I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time in, I think it was 2012. And in that I discuss time dilation as it's reported by individuals. But this time dilation effect clearly is something to do with the release of neurochemicals in the brain. But that doesn't necessarily explain it, but it is profoundly subjective and it's profoundly important. But the first person to write about this was a guy called Albert Heim. And Albert Heim was the president of one of the climbing schools. I think it was in Austria in the 1880s. And he'd had a series of mountaineering accidents. And on each occasion, he had had a panoramic life review as he was falling. In fact, Albert Heim, interestingly enough, was Einstein's maths teacher when Einstein was growing up in Switzerland. So that's an intriguing sideline there. But Heim's ideas were very, very interesting. Now, if this takes place at the point of death, I argue that the panoramic life review in a real death experience doesn't take place instantaneously. I would argue that you actually have a literal reliving of your life second by second throughout your life. And we can touch upon this later. But moving on to Mark, so the near-death experience, just to stress, is absolutely central to my writings, absolutely essential. There was the two things really set me off on the writing: near-death experiences and the deja vu feeling. Okay, so that's the first one. The second point, Mark, is really intriguing. Your point about the pineal gland and the role of the pineal gland in this. Again, many of you guys presumably have not read any of my books, but if you get hold of my book, The Infinite Minefield, I discuss in great detail the role of the pineal gland in all of this. And I also,
just a quick one, we could find out, we could get people to directly message you via Twitter if they have read your books or not, using the hashtag Cheating the Ferryman, and which books they've read. If people want to be involved in that way within our discussion at the moment, if they can't get on via the app or if they're just listening through the browser. That'd be a good one for you, wouldn't it?
If you could do that as well, because to me, there is strong evidence and I mean very, very strong evidence about the role of the pineal gland, not only in near-death experiences, but also as our modulator of reality, as Rick Strassman, the guy that wrote the famous book DMT, The Spirit Molecule. Rick Strassman was a medical professor at the University of New Mexico, and in the 1990s, he was given a grant by the American government to research dimethyltryptamine. Dimethyltryptamine is one of the most powerful hallucinogenic substances known to man. It's found in everything. It's found in plants. It's inside your own body as well. And we'll touch upon that as well in a second. But effectively, Strassman discovered that people have extraordinary experiences very similar to near-death experiences and indeed abduction, UFO abduction scenarios during DMT experiences. But DMT and the pineal gland is very intriguing because the pineal gland, as you're probably aware, is effectively it's light sensitive, and it sits directly above something called the optic chiasma, which is where the optic nerves cross each other from each eyes. The reason it's located...
Just a quick one for you, because obviously some people might come in blind on what this is biologically wise. You might want to just describe roughly whereabouts it is in the brain so that they've got an idea.
I'll give a bit of background to it. The pineal gland is an interesting structure, and it's been noted since ancient times that it's one of the few structures inside the brain that is not double. It's a singular unit, whereas you have two amygdalae, you have two hippocampi, you even have two lobes to the brain. But there are only a few tiny structures in the brain that are only singular. But the most important one that was noticed immediately is the pineal gland. Now, René Descartes, for instance, if you look at some of his work, the French philosopher, he was very intrigued by the role of the pineal gland. But the pineal gland itself is a very interesting structure. For example, in the blood flow in the body, the only other organ that has more blood flow around it than the pineal gland is the liver. And the liver is a much larger thing. But the question is, what is the pineal gland there for? It's a tiny little thing, very, very insignificant. It's called pineal gland because it looks like a pine cone. That's why it's called pineal. And it clearly does something. Now, modern neurologists and neurochemists are aware of one of the things it does do. And I was discussing before about the way in which it sits above something called the optic chiasma. Now, the reason it sits above that is it needs to know something. It's light sensitive. And what it needs to be aware of is whether light is coming in through the eyes and being processed within the brain. Because what happens is when the light signals start to die down, when it's getting dark, the pineal gland has a role. It excretes a substance, an enzyme called melatonin. And melatonin is the substance that makes you want to go to sleep. So effectively, it fulfills a function in that it realizes it's getting dark. It realizes that the body needs to get drowsy, needs to go to sleep. But what is intriguing here is that melatonin is the molecule of melatonin is very, very similar to the molecule of dimethyltryptamine. They're very, very similar. So effectively, there is an argument to say that melatonin could be synthesized, that is changed into DMT. Now, there's been long questions discussed about DMT in the body. It's found in the stomach, it's found in the spinocerebral fluid, and it's found in other locations in the body, but it's never been discovered in the brain. Now, of course, there's a very good reason for this, because it supposedly can't cross the blood-brain barrier. However, and this is very important, if you read documents and you read a lot of articles on DMT, you will find people turning around saying DMT has never been found in the brain. 2017, a researcher called Jimo Borgigian at the University of Virginia, together with 2 or 3 other associates, discovered DMT in the brain of live rats. That's a fact. DMT has been found in brains of mammals, advanced mammals. And the reason that rats are used is rats' brains work very, very similarly to the human brain in terms of how the neurotransmitters work. Now, if DMT is in the brain, it has to, and it's in the pineal gland. The question is, how did it get there? Where did it come from? The logical conclusion is it's actually created by the pineal gland. Now, why, if that is the case, why does this tiny organ create this incredibly hallucinogenic substance within the brain? This then answers one of the huge questions of modern neurology, and it's the question of the role of something called the trace amine-associated receptors in the brain, TARS. These receptors are a mystery within the brain because they don't know. All receptor sites work with typical neurochemicals, neurotransmitters, and they weren't sure what these sites were for. They work with DMT. So in fact, we have evolved within our own bodily structures DMT in order for us to facilitate the creation of DMT within our own brains, which means that DMT is the facilitator of our reality. We are living in effectively a dreamlike state that's facilitated almost by DMT. Now, I'll make one final point before we move on to the next question. And Mark, your question was excellent and a fantastic start. Is something of profound importance here. In India, there is a technique that the swamis use and the gurus use called Kikara Mudra. And Kikara Mudra is the technique whereby you put your tongue to the back of your throat. And people, when they do this, and there might be some of you guys out there, if you do deep meditation, you'll probably know of this. There is sometimes when you go into deep states of meditation, an acidic taste at the back of the throat. It's called the nectar of transcendence. And people, when they train themselves in Kikara Mudra, train themselves to take their tongue to the back of the throat so they can taste this nectar of transcendence, because it puts you into an altered state of consciousness. As far as I know, I'm the only writer that's picked up on this in the world, as far as I'm aware. But it's intriguing because at the 49th day of gestation, the embryo in the womb, as it's developing, 49th day, by the way, if anybody's into Buddhism, when do the Buddhists say that consciousness and the soul comes into the embryo? 49th day of gestation. At the 49th day, something very strange happens in the skull of the embryo. There is a gland at the back of the baby's throat, or the embryo's throat, called the epiphysis. The epiphysis is at the back of the throat, and after the 49th day of gestation, it starts to move from the back of the throat to the center of the brain. Over a period of months, it moves, and then it gets to the center of the brain, and it splits into two. One part of it becomes the pituitary gland, and the other part becomes the pineal gland. Now, as it rolls up, it leaves something called Rathke's pouch or Rathke's cleft, which is a kind of a divot or a hole or a channel that runs from the pineal gland to the back of the throat. Could it be that the pineal gland is releasing DMT, which is then being excreted and going down Rathke's cleft to the back of the throat, and then the thing you are tasting when you're doing that is in fact endogenous dimethyltryptamine? Intriguing, isn't it?
Just a quick one on that, going back to the actual taste. Can it also be described as metallic? Or not? Yes. Is it just mainly right? Okay, because I know some people who obviously go on to medication, say for MS, and they got other IVs or they're on tablets, and sometimes they start tasting the metallic taste. I wonder if there's a correlation between that, which would be quite fascinating.
Yes, I think there is, and in fact, there's been a lot of work done. This guy called Carl Janssen, who is or was a lecturer, a consultant at the Maudsley Hospital in South London. And he came up with some fascinating facts about the similarities between near-death experiences and out-of-the-body experiences. And he thought, is there a link here? Is it neurological? And he found that one particular substance, which is a popular recreational drug called ketamine, is something that reproduces near-death experience sensations. And I know this because I've talked to people who've experienced ketamine experiences. And they go down a tunnel, they hear voices, they have past life readings. Now, ketamine is, again, very, very similar to DMT in its chemical structure. And again, you know, the argument is here, is DMT the facilitator of the near-death experience? Is there a DMT release at the point of death? Now, had I won the BICS competition, or I've been one of the winners, there was a recent competition with the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness, and I put an essay in for that. I didn't win. I was shortlisted to the last 200 and odd, but I didn't get through. Had I won some money on that, I would have invested that money in doing some experiments on this. I don't know how we could do it, but there must be ways that we can do experimentation. The problem is you've got to put somebody to be in a near-death situation, haven't you? In order for the release to take place, you've got to virtually kill them. Then you've got to have things in their brain measuring things. And it'd be so impossible to do.
Or maybe even a saliva test with like a litmus kind of reaction, you know, comes up one colour for one thing.
The problem is you still have to put them in into a near-death situation. And
well, you probably could work in hospices first off, probably. Sorry for interrupting, but you could be that way as well. I just want to say a quick hello to the people in the room which are regular members of the community. Hello, Fractal, haven't seen you for a while. Goldie, how you doing? Brian X, and also R.N. Vooght, who is on a journey, who can't obviously talk at the moment. He is the author I was talking to you about. Brian Fenton's in the space as well, and also Blurry, haven't seen you for a while, and a few others. And then obviously we get back on topic and then go to Wild Eyes. Yep. Sorry for interrupting again.
It's okay, because the thing is, what you'd have to do is you have to put a person in a situation where they either believed they were going to die or they were dying, and you'd have to have some form of measuring devices inside the brain to measure the excretion within the pineal gland of DMT. And the problem is that DMT is very volatile. It doesn't stay around very long. So, it's there for a few seconds, then it fades away. So by the time you get in there, it might have already gone. Now, again, there's a very interesting aside here to do with the near-death experience. There was a fascinating series of experiments done in America, whereby they were wanting to find out about this time dilation effect when you feel you're dying or you're under stress. And they did a series of experiments where they had people do effective bungee jumping. It's not like a bungee jump, but it's similar. And they tested whether, when the people were in these circumstances, whether time dilated. Because as they were falling, they were wearing a watch, and a watch it was a digital watch, had a super fast change of numbers on it. And a number of the people reported that they saw the numbers changing. So the question is here, is it stress related? But my argument against that particular example is these people were part of an experiment. They knew it was an experiment. They knew they were falling, but they knew they weren't going to die. And this is the crucial point. The person has to genuinely believe they're going to die. And that is morally unacceptable. To put somebody through that kind of stress is unacceptable under any experimental conditions. So whether we could ever do this is a moot point. But it's work that has to be done if we are to understand in great detail. And of course, my major critics turn around and say, "Oh, and Anthony Peake, why doesn't he do experiments to prove his theory?" I'd love to, but can you tell me the parameters I could do an experiment to prove this in any way? And even then, it comes back, doesn't it, to somebody saying, "My life flashed before my eyes." It's still a subjective report, and it's a subjective experience. There's no objective way, unless you can show something happening in the brain that we know is a one-to-one relationship between that and a panoramic life review.
And all humans are all different. They've had all different experiences, so you can't replicate exactly the same thing to repeat the same process of the results you get, which is unfortunate.
Exactly.
Also, should we go to Wild Eyes next? And if anybody else wants to put their hand up, we'll make a list of those people and get round to you in order.
Yeah, I have a question from someone in the audience after.
And also Renegade's here, by the way, listening in. So nice to see you, Renegade by nature.
And nice to see Bruce, by the way. Hi, Bruce.
Centered?
No, Wild Eyes is next, and then I'm after Wild Eyes.
Okay, hi, I'm Wild Eyes. I'm from the U.S. The question I have is based on what you just went through with near-death experience. Is there a connection or possibly a trigger to empathic or psychic abilities?
Can I pause you on that one, Wild Eyes? I think you need to explain about your ability as well, because then that'll make more of a connection to Anthony.
Well, to be honest, I did have an experience where I split my head open falling from a swing set. And I don't know if that made a difference. It was not a near-death experience, but I often wondered if it did anything to the wiring in my brain or somehow changed things. I do have psychic abilities. I don't remember experiencing anything at a younger age. I would say well into my teens it started.
That is fascinating. That is fascinating.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was just wanted to add on. That's really interesting because I too split my head open when I was young, and I also experienced psychic abilities. Like my mother was carrying me. I was fast asleep, and she was carrying me from the car into the house. But she tripped, and I fell and split my head open. So yeah, I'm very curious to hear what you have to say.
Oddly enough, I've had a lot of head injuries and I've had strange experiences as well. So I think we're in the same kind of category. By the way, we'll get round to your fractal, don't worry.
Do you know, this is fascinating. And if we were on camera, I could show you something that would send a shiver up your spines collectively. In front of me is a book that I reread recently because in my own podcast on Sunday, I interviewed a guy called Daniel Pinchbeck, who's an American author. And the book is called, and get this, it's Breaking Open the Head.
That's too synchronous by far.
I love the way life does that. But going back to the whole head trauma, yes, it is consistently reported that people, when they have some kind of head trauma, that things change. I'm reminded of the very famous, was it Belgian psychic, was it Crozo? Something like that, in the 1950s, and he had a head injury, and after that his abilities, his psychic abilities, changed completely. I would argue, again, in my book Opening the Doors of Perception, I discuss again this in great detail, because I would argue that it a bang on the head or a profound experience like this reconfigures the neurological constructs of the brain. For instance,
I'd also say it takes the filters off as well, so that you don't have the filters permanently on. They'd be kind of going like Venetian blinds up and down, so you get kind of sporadic information rather than a constant flow.
Correct. I mean, there's been a long argument ever since the late 19th century, when a guy called Henri Bergson came up with the attenuator theory of the brain. And this was continued then by a English philosopher called C.D. Broad. And then it's carried through, of course, to Aldous Huxley in his 1954 book, The Doors of Perception. And the idea is that under certain neurological conditions, what the brain is an attenuator. The brain is there to take out information, not bring in information. So a knock on the head or a profound neurological experience seems to stop the brain's ability to cut out information. So your informational field gets broader, and your abilities, therefore, to pick up information on a broader spectrum becomes the case. Now, this is, again, very, very intriguing as to why this takes place and what is going on here. And I would argue that in my book, Opening the Doors of Perception, I suggest that this is not only neurological, but it is almost an evolutionary factor as well. And it depends upon our neurological conditions as to how open our doors of perception are. I have something I call the Huxleyan spectrum in honor of Aldous Huxley. And what the Huxleyan spectrum says is that most people are neurotypicals. Neurotypicals, their doors of perception, the William Blake concept of the doors of perceptions. And you probably know William Blake wrote a poem, The Auguries of Innocence, I think it was, where he said if the doors of perception were open, we would see the world as it is, infinite, but we are locked in the center of our cavern. So the idea is that injuries like this, they broaden the perceptions, they broaden our abilities to see things. Now, most of us are neurotypicals in that our doors of perception are tightly shut. But under certain circumstances, such as I suffer from, in raised commas, because I don't believe I suffer from it, I actually enjoy it, classical migraine, and I get migraine auras. And the migraine auras are altered states of consciousness. I see things that are not there. I see scotomas, I see patterns. But when you go a bit further along that train, you then move into temporal lobe epilepsy. And people who experience temporal lobe epilepsy, the doors of perception are open fairly effectively. And TLEers, and somebody who will be joining us this afternoon, hopefully, is one of the most incredible people I know, a guy called Myron Dial. And Myron Dial has experienced temporal lobe epilepsy since he was 4 years old. And his temporal lobe epilepsy has opened his doors of perception to such an extent that he has a partner in his life he calls Charon, which is his daemon. And again, in my books, I have something called the daemon Eidolon dyad. And I believe the daemon is the being of light that you have in near-death experiences. But for certain people, the being of light is immanent in your life for the whole of your life. And it talks to you and it guides you, okay? But Myron will be joining us later on. Then you get the doors wide open and it's schizophrenia. And schizophrenia is when the signals are coming in all over the place and you literally cannot control the information you're receiving. It drives you literally crazy because you're seeing things other people can't see, you're hearing things other people can't hear, but they're still real. Just because other people don't hear them, they're called hallucinations. But the definition of hallucination is just something you perceive that nobody else does. Doesn't mean it's not real. It's
but that's
real.
Again, consensual reality. Again, if we both come together, we might see something that somebody else doesn't see. I don't know if you remember Jeff Ritzman that I've spoken to you about, unfortunately passed away earlier this year. Do you remember him, Anthony?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, he was standing with his wife on the side of a field. There was trees, obviously, around the actual field. And when he looked out, he could see a UFO up in the skyline. But his wife couldn't see it. And his wife was literally to his left shoulder. So he didn't move. He just grabbed her by the shoulder and brought her in front of him. And at that point of where he was looking at, and because she was directly in the same line, she could actually see this as well. So both people saw the same thing. He didn't describe it to her. She described it to him. And it was because of the actual, again, perception, just that degree. If you're not in the right spot, the right time, or whatever's affecting the brain, whether it be cosmic radiation or all kinds of peculiarity, again, we're talking about, you've got to be at the right spot, and it's hallucination or not, and it's very difficult to describe. I thought that was worthwhile putting into your one.
Well, that's a very interesting point as well, isn't it? Because, of course, science has a lovely little term for that, and materials reductionist science has a lovely term. They call it a folie à deux. And the idea that if two people share an hallucination, it's got a term for it, but it can't explain it. It doesn't explain how two individual consciousnesses can communicate to each other and can share the same perceptual field that other people can't. And of course, if a huge crowd sees something, it's the madness of crowds. It's mass hallucination, but it's not explaining anything, because of course we know that everything is brain created. Your perceptual field is brain created. Everything you are perceiving now is created by your brain. It's not actually out there. Anybody who believes that out there is as you see it are called naive realists by perceptual scientists. That is an actual term that is used by perceptual scientists. So we have to break out of this egocentric argument and this idea that it's only what we see. I call this electromagnetic chauvinism, the idea that what I see is real. The world is completely different to a bumblebee. Or as I think it was John Searle wrote a very famous paper many years ago called What It's Like to Be a Bat. Was it John Searle? I can't remember. I think it might have been. And the idea in this is, that we perceptually, there are different perceptual fields of reality. And of course, then, can I just move on then? You get schizophrenia. And just to move on from schizophrenia, you then get into, there's other areas like autism. I'm fascinated by autism and how autistic people perceive things differently, how autistic people can be precognitive. And I've witnessed this, precognitive events taking place with autistic people and temporal lobe epileptics, and also Alzheimer's disease. And in the final chapters of Opening the Doors of Perception, I have a whole section on Alzheimer's disease. And I do the neurology. I'm not doing this because I'm turning around and people say they experience it. I go into the neurology. I understand how the amyloid plaques destroy the microtubules within the neurons. I know how it works. And it's the destruction of the microtubules that opens up the doors of perception. And it reflects here on something called orchestrated objective reduction, which is a hypothesis by Stuart Hamerhoff and Roger Penrose, about how quantum physics is responsible for the creation of perceptual reality. So it's intriguing. Now, as a final point, Wild Eyes, somebody you need to check out to work on, particularly with your experiences, is a lady called Penny Sartori, Dr. Penny Sartori, who's been on my shows and is a good friend of mine. And Penny writes about the transformative experiences of near-death experiences and everything else, the way people are changed totally when they have these experiences. And so it should be, because suddenly your doors of perception have been opened. It's equivalent to the myth of Plato's cave. When you have a near-death experience, you're like one of the prisoners that has escaped from the cave and seen reality as it really is. And you go back and tell the other prisoners, and they don't understand because they haven't experienced what you've experienced. But it doesn't make it any more or less real just because it's not consensual.
That's really good. I mean, we can go for hours on that one, which is superb. Once we get to Fractal, before that, if anybody wants to talk, just use the request button, and then we'll make a note of you and then keep you in organized order. Now, Santa, did you put your hand down again? Did you want to go after Fractal or before Fractal?
Oh, no, it should be up. Yeah, I've got a question from somebody in the audience who I'm going to refer to as Hope, and the handle is at DWUK13. So Hope is in there. The profile icon is a black circle. And Hope's question is basically saying, hi, I can't vocally ask, but I would love to hear more thoughts on deja vu. It also fascinates me, and I sometimes go through phases of experiencing that feeling a lot, up to 10 more times a day than nothing for a while. Great space. Thank you for the time. If this is asked, please refer to me. So, yeah, thanks for your contribution, Hope.
Thank you, Hope, for an excellent question again. Your questions are really, really good and perfect for me, really, I think. Déjà vu is the most common extraordinary experienced by human beings across the world. In any one lifetime, 70% of human beings will have at least one déjà vu sensation in their life. What do we mean by déjà vu? Well, technically, the word déjà vu means already seen. I argue that it's a bit more complex than that, and we should use the term déjà vécu, which means already lived. Now, déjà vu has been recorded for centuries, but the terminology only really solided up around.
Can I also ask you to put in about auditory déjà vu as well within your explanation?
I'll mention this déjà senti. Yes, I will, because that's quite an important point. It was late in the 19th century when they had false reconnaissance, various other terms they used, but we came down to déjà vu. Now, again, if you read the literature way back, I mean, if again, Charles Dickens has a section where he writes about déjà vu in one of his novels. You have Alfred Lord Tennyson writing about déjà vu. And of course, interestingly enough, Alfred Lord Tennyson was also a temporal lobe epileptic. So there's a direct link here. There is also a link to temporal lobe epilepsy for another reason, because, and I know this for myself as well in terms of my migraine auras. One of the precursors, one of the clues, one of the aura things that you have when you're about to have either a temporal lobe seizure or you're going to go into an absence seizure, are things called auras, which are kind of sensations you have. And one of the major sensations that people have is a feeling of déjà vu. So somebody knows they are going to have an absence seizure because they start to feel déjà vu sensations. Now, this is of profound significance here. Now, déjà vu, the classic explanation of déjà vu that you will find even now in books on psychology and neurology is called the Efron hypothesis. It was put forward in 1962 by a guy called Robert Efron, and it's called the visual pathways theory. And effectively what it's saying is, you know, I was talking before about the way in which the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye and it crosses above the pineal gland at a place called the optic chiasma. Now, that means effectively that there are two channels of visual information, electric information that comes from one eye and the other eye. And they cross at the optic chiasma and they feed into one hemisphere of the brain or the other. So there are effectively always two visual signals coming in from the external world. Now, on occasions, Efron argued, there could be a set of circumstances whereby the non-dominant hemisphere of the brain processes an external image of the world, a half a second before the dominant hemisphere perceives it. But the signal crosses the corpus callosum, which is the communication channel between the hemispheres, just before the dominant hemisphere sees it. So it gets a feeling of having seen something before. But because we live in our dominant hemisphere, we don't know the consciousness and the awareness of the non-dominant hemisphere. We don't know where we've seen it before. We have this subliminal knowledge of what's happening in the non-dominant hemisphere. So we get the feeling of, I've seen this before, but I don't know where. The problem with the Efron hypothesis is it's only 0.5 of a second. Now, when I get a déjà vu, it's not 0.5 of a second. I know, you know, it's a sense, it's an overall feeling of recognition. It's an overall, it's almost a shiver down the spine feeling and this kind of almost pit of your stomach feeling of sickness sometimes when you go, woof, what is this? Now, the Efron thesis carried forward and still does, but most people who read these books don't read the academic papers because they should, because I think it was in 2017, two researchers at the University of Leeds, a guy called Akira O'Connor, who's a Japanese researcher, and a guy called Chris Moulon. There is actually a research unit at the University of Leeds who looks into déjà vu as a sensation. And they discovered that people who are born blind have déjà sensations. It's called déjà senti. It's already heard. And what happens is they will hear something and then they'll hear it again. Now, the neurological pathways and the way the brain functions, it cannot be explained using a similar analogy to the visual pathways, but it's the same sensation. So the whole explanation that people go on about is dumped. It's not right. It doesn't work. Déjà vu. There was a book written recently, a few years ago, by a guy at a university in the southern states of America on déjà vu. His name escapes me at the moment. And In that book, he says there are 72 different explanations for deja vu, 72, all of which either overlap or are mutually exclusive. I'm proud to say that one of those explanations is my cheating the ferryman. So I'm in that book. So cheating the ferryman is considered to be a valid explanation of deja vu. So what is really taking place here? Well, I think, can I say one or two other things? And again, going back to the question about the pineal gland. I was contacted a few years ago by a young guy who was a postgraduate student in literal rocket science. And we met up, and he explained to me that my first book had changed his life. I get this a lot, which is really nice to hear. And he said, you've explained my life experiences far better than anybody else. And I get this a lot from people. Okay. And the idea is he has a tumor, a benign tumor on his pineal gland. He gets, as he told me, he says he gets phenomenal deja vu sensations, but they are precognitive as well. So in other words, he gets a deja vu sensation where he knows what's going to happen next. For the next 3 or 4 seconds, he knows what's going to happen. And I said to him, so if you know what's going to happen and you're talking to somebody, why don't you just tell them, I know what's going to happen, I know what you're going to say. And he said something very, very, very important. He turned around and he said, if I did that, they wouldn't say it. And he's quite right. If I know what you're going to say now and I go, you're going to say this, you're not going to turn around and say what you're going to say. Well, you're going to go, what do you mean? Or isn't that amazing? Now, I've got more evidence for this. I did a radio show on BBC Radio Merseyside a few years ago on deja vu. We had people phoning in. The amount of people that phoned in that actually told us about precognitive deja vus, including one man who said he was watching television. And as he was watching television, he was hearing the presenter's voice twice and seeing it on the screen twice. He got so worried by this, he got up and left his wife in the living room and walked out the living room. And as he's standing outside the living room, he actually sees somebody walk past the glass front door, and they walk past again. It's like the deja vu sequence, if anybody knows it, in the Matrix movie with the cat, where they see the cat move and then they see it again. Okay, he had exactly the same effect, but he realized he could prove he was precognitive, and this is extraordinary. What he did was he stood outside the door of the living room, and he waited until he knew what his wife would say when he walked in through the room a split second later. And he wrote it down on a piece of paper, folded it over, walked in. She said the words, and he handed her the piece of paper with the words that she said to him on it. Now, that to me was absolute concrete proof by an ordinary guy on a phone-in. That's how powerful this is. So the idea is that deja vu is what it feels like. And I argue it feels like it for one very good reason. And I'll leave this hanging in the air for you. It's because this is not the first time you have lived this life, and it is a memory. You are remembering your past life, and you find yourself in the same set of circumstances that you did last time, and suddenly, like memories are, the memory is triggered subliminally, and you go, I've done this before. That is what deja vu is.
That's an excellent explanation, and it's great that Marindal might have the opportunity to come across. We're into the next hour, and if people do want to actually pose a question, please just obviously push the request button, and then we can add you to the list. You were going to say something, Melissa? Got to get to Fractal, but what were you going to say?
I just wanted to squeeze that in there because it's on the topic of deja vu, and it's coming from Gabe, Decoding Strange, if he isn't sure of who he is. He's down there in the room, and he was saying, I predict dialogue watching television, deja vu never having seen the program.
Wow.
Gabe is a great character because we've had him on as a guest. He was part of the community, and he came up and did a 2-hour conversation about all the different things that have happened to him and the way that he's seen his internal daemon interact within the dream state as well. So that's kind of worthwhile having additional knowledge for yourselves.
Fascinating. What I would like to do is, if anybody has had these kind of experiences, I know that the argument is that the plural of anecdote is not proof, but I'd argue, well, it's repeatability. It means that other people are experiencing the same thing, and isn't the scientific process that you repeat an experiment and prove it. If I can prove that people around the world in different cultures all have these precognitive deja vu experiences, I think I've proved my hypothesis.
Oh, definitely. Sorry for the long time, Fractal. Come in and take the floor.
Hi, I'm Fractal. My question is for an elaboration on what Wild Eye said with NDEs and people coming back and seeming to have psychic abilities. But there's also people who come back and have like abilities like they've never touched a piano and all of a sudden they know how to play piano, or they know how to take photographs and they've never picked up a camera. And brain damage can't really explain that. So are you saying that this information comes from sort of the Akashic field I've heard, or is it something else, like maybe a different timeline?
Right. This is, again, excellent question. In my book, The Infinite Minefield, you'll probably discover that most subjects that people are interested in, I've written about in at least one book. And in The Infinite Minefield, I discuss the concept of the Akashic field or the Akashic record, and the idea that there is some form of informational field. And indeed, in my last book, The Hidden Universe, I go into in great detail the physics of this and the cosmology of this. And the idea is that there is an informational field that exists just above absolute zero in terms of temperature zones. That's why it's called the 0 point field. It's a field of information that sits just above absolute zero. Now, a little bit here about basic physics. As you probably know, all that heat is subatomic particles moving at speed, atoms moving at speed and everything else. And that's what generates the sensation or the feeling of heat. But there is a point where subatomic particles cease to move. And of course, subatomic particles move because the temperature gets higher. Because the temperature gets higher, they move more and they move more. But there's a point where subatomic particles cease to move. And there is no heat generated because there's no heat to move them. And that's called the 0 point field, which is absolute zero, which is minus 2.73.17 degrees Celsius or 0 Kelvin. And that's where there is no energy. But what they've been doing in recent years is they've been taking substances down to within a billionth of a degree of absolute zero. There's a substance called helium-3, I think it is, that they can take down to that level. But the thing is, helium-3 still remains liquid, which means there's an energy coming from somewhere. And that energy can only be coming from somewhere else. Okay, and they believe it's the 0 point field. Now, on top of this energy field...
Oh, just a quick one on helium-3, if we're on the right bit. They said that if you get a cargo load of that from the moon, helium-3, you could actually power the United States for a year on that conversion.
That's exactly it. Helium-3, it is argued that helium-3 can process 0 point energy. And that's why helium-3 is so fascinating and so important, because it's something that seems to be tuning into a field of energy that's infinite. Okay, and that's the 0 point field. Now, just going back, the other thing again, for you, the science buffs out there, if you want to discuss this with friends who are cynical about this and saying that Anthony Peake is a complete charlatan, doesn't know what he's talking about, it's also to do with something called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is the idea that you can either know the position or the velocity of an object, but you can never know both. Now, think about this for a second. If a subatomic particle isn't moving anymore, you know its position because you know where it is, and you know it's not moving, which means that violates Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which is, again, impossible. So therefore, there has to be a form of energy down there. Now, this energy itself seems to be in a field form. But not only that, I wrote a book a few years ago with Professor Irvin Laszlo, and Laszlo and I are really fascinated by the implications of this 0 point field. And we believe it's an energy field. We believe not only is it an energy field, it's an information field. It's not energy in the way we understand it. Recent discoveries have found that information is a form of energy. Information has mass. Information can generate heat. So therefore, information itself is a physical form. Now, if this is the case, then there's something quite strange understanding here, which means information is non-physical, but it seems to have form. Now, could it be that everything we exist in, everything that is around us, is in fact a field of information? It is not physically solid, because we know from quantum physics that the table you're leaning on or the chair you are sitting on is 99.99999999996 empty space. And the things that make up that physical supposed presence are things called quarks. And quarks themselves are point particles, which means, again, they have no extension in space. The same goes for photons. They have no extension in space, light. So therefore, what we think is physical reality is not physically there at all. The only reason you don't fall through the chair of your seat, the seat of your chair, is because of something called electrostatic repulsion. It's the edges of the atoms have electrons spinning around them, and they're negative. And the edge of your bottom also has, the atoms of your bottom also has electrons whizzing around them that are negative. Two negative charges repulse. That's the reason that you don't. That's the reason you never touch anything. You never touch anything. You never touch anything in that external world. Whatever is out there, you never touch it. That is a scientific fact. So we're then in the situation of, well, what is this energy field? Now, I'd argue that going directly back to the question about people who have near-death experiences and suddenly have skills they never had, it's because they're tuning into the information field. Not only that, but I argue in the book that we are one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no individuality. We are not individuals. We believe ourselves to be individuals, but we are not. We are a collective force. Life is a collective force. Life is a unity. But we are emanations like waves on an ocean. But when you have extraordinary experiences or a near-death experience, you attune into the ocean, you attune into the information field. And when you attune into the information field, you can bring information back that you didn't already have. And that information can be a skill. I'm fascinated by the concept of savant syndrome. People who seem to just instinctively know things. Kim Peake, for instance, the Rain Man, is an example. But I work with, there's one young lady, get this, there's one young lady, and if you want to go onto my YouTube site, this will blow your mind. Believe me, this will blow your mind. My YouTube site has got some fascinating stuff on there, but this is the most extraordinary. There's a young lady called Rebecca Sharrock. She's a young Australian, lives in Melbourne. She is one of only 8 people in the world that has what's called superior autobiographical memory. She remembers every single thing that has ever happened to her in her life, including her dreams and including the time before she was born in the womb. We tested her live on a radio station. I interviewed her and we tested her live on this. Now, my assistant on the show, Sarah, her daughter is heavily into Harry Potter. So is Rebecca. So without telling her, in the middle of the show, I said, we're now going to test you. I'm going to have Sarah pick a Harry Potter book out at random, any of the books, and I'm going to have her open a page at random and pick a paragraph. And I'm going to have her start reading the paragraph, and I want you to finish it. She did it live on radio. Sarah started reading the paragraph. She got 3 words in, 3 words. And Rebecca, out from her mind, said the whole of the paragraph as Sarah was looking at it. Now,
well, I was also going to say, you've also got the other guy you interviewed is Trent, who was American, I think, as well, who was a savant about 3 years back as well.
Yes. I'm trying to. We had Daryl Trefford on as well, and Daryl Trefford was the guy that worked with Kim Peake, and he was the technical advisor on the movie Rain Man. And he told us some incredible things about Kim Peake as well. So what is going on here? Where is this informational field? Because it sure as hell isn't in their brains. It's coming from somewhere else. It's being drawn up from a deeper level and well of information. Now, of course, the Theosophists would call it the Akashic record, the Akashic field, going back to Vedanta. But it's more scientific than this. And again, in my books, I discuss that it's to do with black holes. It's to do with something called Hawking radiation. It's to do with something called a holographic principle. We exist in a hologram. We are existing in a 2-dimensional projection of a 3-dimensional reality, and we're inside it. And in my latest book, I'm discussing the science of the simulation argument, the idea that this is a simulation, and we are all part of that. We are information creatures. And under certain circumstances, we can attune into the broader field. This then explains telepathy. It explains lucid dreaming. It can explain out-of-the-body experiences. Because, of course, if this reality is just one of a number of informational fields, you're just moving in a different informational field. You move out of your body, but you're not moving anywhere. You're moving within a consciousness field, if that makes sense.
Oh, it does. I mean, one of the things that I've been discussing with the people that turn up for the Twitter space, and again, CentredAwareness, Fractal, RN Vooght, Wild Eyes, Plough Nation, Estevel, Fuji, and the others that turn up, I've been kind of saying, until we know anything better, you have consciousness and then everything's inside consciousness, as in all material and everything else. And it'd be fascinating to try and figure out where it all came from. But you can't get away from consciousness. And that's one of the big things that you've been discussing for years, and also what we try and discuss and try and figure out.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the biggest question. The only thing we know, each one of us in this room, the only thing we know with any certainty is that we are something experiencing something. That's all we know. We don't know anything else. And when we start to realize that is when am I still there, guys?
Yes, we are. We haven't left you yet.
Oh, good. Good. It's just
Meanwhile, anybody wants to talk, put a request in to us and we'll put you in the listener section, then just put your hand up and we'll get around to you as well. Carry on, Anthony.
Yeah, so I was going to say, so the really important point here is that the only thing we know is that we are aware. But we don't even know what is that's aware, even. You go deeply into philosophy, the idea, when you start to look inwards to find out what is the you inside your head, you get lost. You find that there's nothing really there. You know, it's almost smoke and mirrors that we're led to believe that we are something experiencing something. But of course, people will argue this is a danger, and it's called falling into solipsism. The idea that the only thing I can really prove is that I'm the only thing that exists. That is true. But if you then recognize the fact that everybody else is also existing and part of you, and you are part of them, suddenly things get a bit more strange and a bit more interesting, because it means if I'm you and you're me, if I impose pain on you, at some stage I'm going to receive that pain. I'm going to feel that pain. And is this what took place with my friend when he was in the sea, when he sensed the pain of the woman who hit him in the car? And the idea that at some point in our lives, we will experience the sensory field of all the things that we have done in our lives.
Oh, definitely. I'm not sure. You probably have seen this, but we had a Twitter Space event where Fractal had actually suggested watching the short story by Andy Weir called The Egg. Have you seen that animation or read the story, Anthony?
No.
It is fascinating. Basically, Anthony Weir says that you're coming into a universe, you experience everything, and you are everybody else inflicting the pain, like you have said before. But Kurzgesagt, which is a German company, animation, have done a really slick animation for it. And it's only 8 minutes, but it goes through that you're basically evolving as an embryo within a universe before you actually go off and meet the other entities outside. But there is one entity that is actually guiding you along the pathway once you've passed out, so that you go back and repeat the process multiple times. And again, it's very similar to the daemon kind of idea. But it was really such a great topic that was brought up by Fractal to come back, because we're doing ones about the pros and cons of reincarnation, what books and what religions and everything else have differences on. And I'd really worthwhile anyone pick up on YouTube. It's called The Egg. It's a short story, and it's by the author, The Martian. It's by the writer who wrote The Martian, Andy Weir, and that's Weir. But it's a fascinating one to see.
Sounds suspiciously like Cheating the Ferryman to me. When did he write it?
Oh, yeah.
When did he write it?
You're asking me to now type in things I should find out for you.
I know that Cheating the Ferryman is not necessarily a unique concept.
No, Andy Weir doesn't believe in this, though, by the way. He wrote it as a story. He said he writes about mermaids and things, and he doesn't believe in those. Just trying to find a year. Maybe Melissa can find out a year at the same time, or somebody can just quickly tell me.
I believe in the concept of the zeitgeist and the idea that these ideas come forward when they are ready. And I think there's an awful lot of people who subliminally know this to be correct, know that my Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis, or the model that I'm describing in the Cheating the Ferryman hypothesis, is correct. And
2009, by the way.
Pardon?
2009, so you got there first.
I got there first, yeah. Like I got there first before the wonderful genius that is...
no, be careful what you say, please. I don't want this to be scrubbed off.
Okay, but the wonderful...
Any insults of fighting and infighting. We're a very nice, calm, relaxed environment in here, please.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so the ideas, I think, are bubbling under, and the time is right now for these ideas, I think. You know, we know about virtual reality. We have our virtual reality headsets. We can now visualize, literally experience being in another seemingly three-dimensional reality that we can walk around. I mean, one of the things I found extraordinary is many years ago I used to play a game on the PC called Myst, which is a fascinating, really relaxing puzzle environment that you walk around in the environment and you find puzzles. You just find yourself on this beautiful island. And it's really relaxing and fascinating. I recently downloaded the virtual reality version. They've upgraded it to virtual reality. So you put your virtual reality headset on and you're wandering around on this island and you can go in any direction, and it is extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. So I've argued to say, just for a thought for a second, just imagine a scenario that somebody could create a computer game, a three-dimensional virtual reality computer game of your life, and then you put on a headset and you're in that world, and then you put on a body set with tactile feedback from your movements in this world, and they reproduce in the external world of your life. Then you wipe your memories clean of your memories of this life, and then you are catapulted back to the moment of your birth. How would you know? How would you know that you were in a simulation?
You wouldn't know. I mean, it's very similar to the Alan Watts kind of bit of going to bed and dreaming and having your 80 years in that point. It's a fascinating thought experiment.
Yeah, and I believe this is what's happening. This is what we're all doing.
Does anybody want to make a request so they can throw a question at Anthony? I know that Melissa might want to say something, but I think you might want to, Anthony, talk about one of your recent interviews on YouTube with, just make sure I get this right, Steve Meyer.
To help our research and understanding, leave Perceptions Today's podcast reviews, subscribe to the podcast, along with the other social media accounts, and share. Come and join our live events. That way we can get together and have thoughtful discussions along with advancing our understanding of concepts as we go along.